Some memories never age. They don't fade like photographs, don't soften like the ache in your knees. They live in your body, in the way you flinch when a door slams, the way you freeze when you hear a man's footsteps behind you, the way you wake in the middle of the night feeling like you can't breathe again. I'm 82 years old. My name is Evelyn May Harper. I live alone in a small house in Missouri, near a river where morning fog settles on the water like a blanket. My neighbors know me as a quiet old lady who grows roses and feeds stray cats. They smile when I pass by, never realizing that inside me, there still lives a girl who never had a chance to become a child. I was born in 1939 in eastern Kentucky, in a place that was only vaguely marked on maps. A small valley nestled in the Appalachian Hills, a single dusty road, a two-grade school, a church, and miners' houses cobbled together from gray planks. We lived in a house where the wind blew through the cracks in the walls, and in winter, ice formed on the inside of the windows. My father worked in a coal mine. My mother washed other people's laundry and had children almost nonstop. There were 7 of us. I was the second eldest and the eldest girl. From an early age, I knew my job was to help, not to dream, not to ask, not to complain, to help. I knew how to cook beans and cornmeal when I was 6. I changed the younger children's diapers while my mother lay exhausted after another birth. I learned to speak softly and walk so as not to disturb. In our house, noise meant trouble. A loud voice meant a belt. A question meant a slap. Tears meant mockery. I loved school. It was the only place I was allowed to sit quietly and think. Miss Clark, our teacher, called me observant. She sometimes kept me after class to give me books to read that weren't on the curriculum. I read them at home, hiding them under my pillow while everyone else slept. In these books, people left, chose their lives, fell in love of their own free will. I didn't know then that this would be the most dangerous dream. When I turned 13, my mother began to look at me differently, not as a child, but as a problem that needed to be settled. Money was tight, my father was increasingly drunk, and the mine was cutting shifts. I felt the space around me shrinking. My dresses grew longer, my mother's gaze grew colder, and the adults' conversations in the kitchen grew quieter but more troubling. On the day everything changed, it was raining. A heavy, sticky summer rain that made the earth smell of iron. I was scrubbing the floor, kneeling, when my father said, "Evelyn, come here." His voice was even, the kind you speak in when everything is already decided. He was sitting at the table, my mother standing next to me, her hands folded as if at a funeral. I knew immediately. This wasn't a conversation. This was a death sentence. They told me I was getting married to a man I'd seen twice. He was 42. He owned a sawmill and a house with a real bathroom. They said it was an opportunity, that I should be grateful, that girls like me weren't chosen. They were decided for them. I tried to say no. The words stuck in my throat, but I forced it out anyway. Then my father stood up. He didn't yell. He just walked up to me and hit me hard in the face, knocking me down. No one yelled. No one intervened. My mother turned away. In that moment, I realized something terrible and profound. I was alone. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to my little sister and counted her breaths. I knew that in the morning I would leave, forever. That my home, no matter how cold and cruel it was, would no longer be mine. I didn't cry. I felt empty inside. as if someone had taken everything alive out of me and carefully closed the lid. In the morning, they dressed me in my best dress. It belonged to someone else, altered, and smelled of mothballs. My fiancé was waiting in the car. He smiled at me the way you smile at a purchase. When the car pulled away, I looked back until the house disappeared around the corner. I didn't know then that what lay ahead of me wasn't life, but survival. And if you think pain ends in childhood, you're wrong. Sometimes it's only just beginning to learn to speak. The house they brought me to stood on the outskirts of a forest. Tall, dark, with a porch where the boards creaked as if warning in advance. Every step would be heard here. I remembered that sound forever. The creak, and everything inside me tightened. I didn't yet know then that fear could be so constant that it became a background noise, like the sound of the wind or the ticking of a clock. His name was Walter Briggs. To everyone else, Mr. Briggs. To me, my husband. The word was foreign, heavy, like an ill-fitting coat. He was large, with hands accustomed to command. Not to work, but to command. He spoke little, but his every glance was a command. He didn't ask, he waited. There was almost no wedding. A few people from the church, a short sermon about duty and obedience, a ring that turned out to be too big for me. I don't remember the words, only the feeling of being locked in a windowless room. When the pastor said, "You may kiss the bride," I stood motionless. Walter leaned over and touched my lips quickly, formally. People smiled. I didn't. That same evening, I realized that childhood was truly over. Not because I had become an adult, but because I no longer had the right to be a child. I won't describe that night. Not because I'm ashamed, but because some things don't need details to be understood. I'll just say one thing. I lost it. I found a small, dark spot inside and hid there. This skill saved me for many years. At first, I lived in a fog. The house was big, but empty. There was no laughter, no warmth. Only order. And rules. I had to get up at 5 in the morning, make breakfast, clean, do laundry, wait. Wait for him to come back. Wait for him to tell me. Wait for him to let me. I wasn't allowed to leave without his permission. I wasn't allowed to write letters. I wasn't allowed to ask questions. He said he was making a woman out of me, that I should be grateful. Sometimes he was silent, cold. Sometimes he was hot-tempered. And then, words weren't the answer. I quickly learned to read his mood by his steps, by the way he hung his jacket, by the way he placed a mug on the table. It became my survival skill. If there had been diplomas for the ability to anticipate danger back then, I would have gotten the highest. Several months passed before I realized for the first time that I couldn't bear it. Not physically, my body could handle that. But internally, I began to realize I didn't care whether I woke up in the morning. That was the most terrifying thing. Not the pain, but the indifference to my own life. The pregnancy was discovered early. I wasn't overjoyed or scared. I simply accepted it as another fact. Walter, on the other hand, became different. He stroked my belly, talked about an heir, about the future. His care was like control wrapped in soft paper. I was only as important as his blood grew within me. With the pregnancy came a new form of loneliness. I no longer even belonged to myself. My body became territory I had no rights to. Sometimes I whispered to the child, at night, lying in the dark. I said things no one had ever said to me. That he was important, that no one would sell him, that he would choose. But it wasn't meant to be. I lost my baby in the winter. Without further ado, without any tragic scenes. One day, it just became clear he was gone. The doctor said, "It happens." Walter said nothing at all. He looked at me as if I'd ruined something. After that, he became harsher, as if I no longer had any purpose. That's when I first thought about escaping. Not as a dream, but as a necessity. I began to notice details. Where the keys were, when he left, which roads led to the city. These thoughts were dangerous, but they made me feel like I was still alive. Help came from an unexpected source, from a woman named Rose. She came to clean the house once a week. She was twice my age, with tired eyes and a soft voice. She never asked questions, but one day, noticing a bruise, she said quietly, "You don't have to die here." It was the first human sentence addressed to me in a long time. We began to talk furtively. She talked about the city, about working at the factory, about women who left and started anew. I listened as one listens to legends, but somewhere inside, those words began to take shape. The decision matured quickly. Fear gave way to rage. Cold, silent. I knew if I stayed, I would be gone. Not right away, but definitely. And I chose the risk. The night he left on a business trip, Rose drove me to the bus station. I had a little money, a change of clothes, and a name I could again pronounce without shaking. Evelyn. Just Evelyn. When the bus pulled away, I didn't cry. I looked out the window and felt something inside me begin to return to its place. Not happiness, not joy, but the right to breathe. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time, I knew where I was coming from, and that was enough. The bus dropped me off in St. Louis early in the morning. The gray sky hung low, like the ceiling in a poorly ventilated room. The air smelled of the river and coal. I stepped out onto the platform with a small suitcase and the feeling of stepping into someone else's life uninvited. No one was waiting. No one knew my name. And there was a strange, almost painful freedom in this. For the first few hours in the city, I walked aimlessly. I simply moved because stopping meant thinking, and thinking was dangerous. I feared every man in a dark coat, every harsh voice, every glance that lingered longer than a second. I kept imagining he would find me, that at any moment someone's hand would fall on my shoulder and the past would close like a trap. I spent my first night in a women's shelter near the train tracks. It was noisy, smelled of cheap soap and fatigue. But no one asked questions. They gave me a bed, a thin blanket, and a cup of hot coffee. I held it with both hands, as if it might disappear if I loosened my grip. Then I realized how deeply the fear of losing even the slightest comfort lurked within me. In the morning, I started looking for a job. Without references, without education, without experience, except for the ability to work myself to the point of exhaustion and keep quiet. This turned out to be an unexpectedly useful skill. I washed dishes at a diner, swept floors at a department store, sorted boxes in a warehouse. The work was hard, the pay was meager, but I got paid myself. For myself. The feeling was almost intoxicating. I rented a bunk in a 4-person room from a widow named Mrs. Gray. She wasn't kind, but she was honest. Money up front, no guests, quiet after 10. That suited me. I wasn't looking for comfort. I needed a refuge. In the evenings, I sat on my bed and learned to be myself again. Without orders. Without expectations. I chose when to sleep, what to eat, where to go. These little things felt like a revolution. Sometimes it made my head spin. Freedom wasn't easy. It demanded responsibility, and I never had that before. The past wouldn't let go. I woke up from nightmares in which I heard the creaking of the porch again, his footsteps, my name spoken like property. During the day, I was strong. At night, I was that girl again, with nowhere to run. I learned to fall asleep with the light on and a chair propped against the door. It was safer that way. The turning point came unexpectedly. A woman named Lillian worked at the diner where I washed dishes. She was loud, with a loud laugh and a cigarette always stuck to her lips. One day, she noticed how I flinched when the owner raised his voice. After her shift, she said, "You're not broken. You're wary. Those are two different things." These words became a kind of permission for me not to hate myself. Lillian took me to night school at the church. There they taught me to read faster, write correctly, and count. I was afraid to go. I associated school with what had been taken away from me. But I went. I sat at a desk next to women my age and older, each with her own story. We didn't question each other. We simply learned. And that was enough. The city gradually lost its hostility. I began to recognize the streets, the shops, the faces. I developed a favorite route along the river, where I could breathe deeply. Sometimes I caught myself laughing. Not loudly, carefully, as if testing the waters for safety. The hardest thing was accepting that no one would come to save me. That if I wanted to live, I would have to do it myself. This thought was both terrifying and empowering. I stopped waiting. I stopped looking back. I started building. One day at night school, the teacher assigned me to write a short story about myself. I stared at the blank page and didn't know where to begin. My past was too difficult, my future too uncertain. Then I wrote one sentence. I am alive, and this is my choice. That was enough. By the end of the year, I was no longer a runaway. I had become a worker, a student, a neighbor. I had a name, albeit without a resounding story. I was still afraid, but fear no longer controlled me. It became a warning, not a prison. The city didn't immediately become my home, but it gave me the most important thing, space. And in space you can grow. I didn't yet know who I would become, but I knew who I would never allow myself to be made into again. A name isn't just a sound. It's how the world speaks to you and how you respond. For a long time, my name was a trap for me. Evelyn sounded too loud, too familiar, as if someone could grab it and pull me back to where I'd fled. I said it quietly, almost apologetically, and each time I felt something inside me tighten. The decision to change my name didn't come immediately. At first, it was just a thought, cautious, like stepping on thin ice. What if I could be someone else? Not another woman, no, but the same one, but without the shackles of the past. I spent a long time turning over options in my head, tasting them, whispering them at night, as if testing for fear. In the end, I settled on the name Clara. It seemed simple, clear, without unnecessary angles. A name I could wear every day. On paper, I was still Evelyn Harper. Changing my papers was difficult and expensive. But in life, in conversations at work, I became Clara. And amazingly, the world accepted it without resistance. No one asked why. No one demanded an explanation. The city truly didn't ask questions unless you provoked them. I quit my job at the diner in the spring, not because it was bad, but because I felt I could do more. This feeling was new and more terrifying than fatigue and dirty dishes. Through Lillian, I learned of a vacancy in the hospital laundry. The work was hard, the shifts were long, but the pay was steady and the employment was official. I showed up for the interview in a simple dress, my hair neatly pulled back, and my new name on my lips. My boss, Mrs. O'Neill, was a stern woman with a short haircut and a habit of looking me straight in the eye. She asked a few questions, looked at my hands, my posture, my bearing. Then she said, "You're not afraid of work. It's obvious. Come back tomorrow at 6 o'clock." I left the office with shaky knees and the feeling of having just been given a pass to a new life. The laundry became a school of endurance and human connection for me. Women from all over the city worked there, black and white, young and old, loud and silent. We sorted laundry, carried baskets, stood by the machines in the heat and steam. Conversations flowed above the noise, in snatches, about children, about husbands, about prices, about back pain. I listened more than I spoke, learning to be part of a team without disappearing or hiding. It was there that I first felt I could trust. Not right away, not completely, but little by little. I laughed at jokes, shared sandwiches, accepted help when I was tired. It was hard to accept. In the past, help always had a price. Here it didn't, or at least not the one I was used to. I continued going to school in the evenings. Studying ceased to be a lifeline and became a goal. I found myself enjoying solving problems, reading texts, writing in neat handwriting. Knowledge restored my self-respect. Every formula I learned, every correctly written word was proof. There was nothing wrong with me. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't empty. I wasn't broken. Sometimes the past still reminded me of itself. One time, returning from work, I saw a man who looked very much like Walter. The same gait, the same set of his shoulders. Panic washed over me, sharp, animalistic. I rushed to the nearest building entrance and sat there for almost an hour until my breathing evened out. When I emerged, the man was gone. I walked home slowly, repeating to myself, "It's not him. He's not here. You're safe." These words became my prayer. Gradually, I began to think of the future not as a fog, but as a road. I made plans, cautious but realistic. Pass my exams. Find an easier job. Rent a separate room. Maybe someday a small apartment. These thoughts weren't frightening. They warmed me. Changing my name changed not only how others addressed me, but also how I spoke to myself. Clara was bolder. She could say no. She could leave if she felt threatened. I could want. It was the most unusual thing, allowing myself to want something without making excuses. I still wrote letters, but now to myself. In a notebook hidden under the mattress, I jotted down thoughts, fears, small victories. Sometimes memories that haunted me. I didn't try to embellish them. I simply recorded them as they were. It was like unraveling knots, one by one, slowly but surely. One day Lillian said, "You know, Clara, you've started walking differently. Before, it was as if you were apologizing for every step. But now, no." I was surprised, but then I realized it was true. My body no longer expected the blow. It was learning to be just a body, not an alarm system. By the end of the year, I moved from the 4-person room to a small studio apartment above the drugstore. It had its own sink, tiles, and a window overlooking the street. I bought curtains, yellow ones with a small flower print. I hung them myself, awkwardly but proudly. It was the first space that belonged solely to me. I sat on the floor with a cup of cheap tea, watching the light filter through the fabric, and thought, this is it. The beginning. I still didn't know who I would be in 5 or 10 years. But for the first time, I knew who I already was. A woman who had chosen her name, who hadn't disappeared, who remained, and that was enough to move on. I'd long thought that a heart was a luxury, that it was reserved for those who had a normal childhood, who didn't learn to survive before they learned to dream. I thought that if I allowed myself to become attached, the past would immediately find a crack and creep in. So, I kept my distance. Friendly, polite, safe. Just enough so that I wouldn't be lonely, but also not vulnerable. This went on for almost 2 years. I no longer flinched at every noise. I could sleep in the dark, and sometimes I even forgot to double lock the door. I worked in the hospital laundry, studied in the evenings, paid rent for my small studio, and felt like I was standing on my own 2 feet. Not confidently, not widely, but I was on my own. And it was at that moment that a man appeared in my life who demanded nothing. His name was Thomas Reed. He worked as a technician at the same hospital. He fixed equipment, tinkered with pipes, electrical wiring, all the things no one notices while they're working. We'd bump into each other in the hallways, nod to each other, exchange a few words about the weather. He wasn't the kind of man who filled up space. Quite the opposite, he left it to others. One day, the laundry machine broke down, and we were all sent on break. I was sitting on the stairs with a cup of coffee when he came up and asked if he could sit down. He asked, but didn't sit right away. For some reason, that simple gesture struck a chord. We talked. About nothing important. About how the coffee here is disgusting. About how long winter has been this year. About books. It turns out he reads. A lot. I was surprised. We started having lunch together once a week. Then more often. He never asked unnecessary questions. Never tried to touch me without permission. When I fell silent, he didn't fill the silence. He let the silence be. It was unusual and dangerous because I felt calm around him. For a long time, I convinced myself it was just friendship, that I felt more comfortable this way. But my body knows the truth before my head. I caught myself looking forward to these lunches, listening to his footsteps in the hallway, smiling when I saw him from afar. It was more frightening than loneliness. I made my first real choice in the spring. Thomas invited me for a walk after work, just a walk along the river. I could have refused. I could have found 100 reasons, but I said yes. And this yes was not dictated by the fear of being alone. It was mine. We walked in silence, then talked. He talked about his childhood in Iowa, about his mother raising him alone, about how he realized early on that he didn't want to be like his father. I listened and felt something slowly soften inside me. When he asked about me, I said only, I left to start over. He nodded. That was enough. He didn't try to rush things. He didn't demand intimacy. The first time we held hands, it happened almost by accident. Our fingers brushed, and neither of us pulled away. I remember being surprised. There was no panic, just a gentle warmth and a strange feeling, like I'd returned to my own body. But the past doesn't like to be forgotten. One evening, walking home, I saw an envelope under the door.
No stamp.
No sender's address. My heart sank. I knew that handwriting. Uneven, angular. I stood in the hallway, hesitating to enter, until my neighbor passed by and nodded at me. The world went on. So the letter wasn't explosive. Just words. It was brief inside. My old name. A demand to return. A threat. He wrote that he knew where I was. That I belonged to him. That he wouldn't tolerate shame. Each word struck like old seams, testing whether they would hold. I sat on the floor and stared at the wall for a long moment. Then I stood up, slowly, like I'd learned in school. First my breath, then my legs. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I did something I'd never done before. I went for help. I told Lillian everything. Then Mrs. O'Neill. Then Thomas. The words came out hard, but they didn't destroy me. No one doubted me. No one said I was exaggerating. Thomas simply said, "You're not alone. We'll figure it out." We went to the police. I was shaking, but I spoke. I gave him my name. I told him about the marriage, about the escape, about the letter. The officer was young and serious. He listened. He wrote it down. He said that threats were already grounds. That if he showed up, I had the right to defend myself. That word, right, sounded almost unreal. A few weeks later, another letter arrived. Then silence. I don't know if he got scared, lost interest, or found another victim. I only know one thing. He didn't come. And I didn't go back. My relationship with Thomas changed. I was afraid he'd see something broken, something problematic in me. But he saw me whole. With fear. With my past. With caution. And he didn't try to fix it. He was simply there. When he kissed me for the first time, I didn't flinch. My heart was pounding, but not from terror, from life. I allowed myself to feel it, and it was scary. And rightly so. I understood then. Healing isn't the absence of pain. It's the choice to live despite it. The choice to trust when it's easier to shut down. The choice not to run when the past knocks at the door. I chose to stay. In my life. In my body. In my name. And the past, for the first time, retreated. When fear ceases to be the master, it doesn't go away immediately. It becomes a neighbor. Quiet, wary, sitting in the corner of the room. Sometimes it raises its head, sometimes it stirs, but it no longer dictates how you live. It took me time to understand the difference, and even longer to believe that I have the right to a life in which I don't have to disappear for someone else's peace of mind. After Walter's letter and going to the police, it was as if I crossed an invisible line. Not because the danger had completely disappeared, no, but because I was no longer silent. I called a spade a spade. I came out of the shadows, and the world, despite my fears, didn't turn away. Thomas didn't become my savior, and that's precisely why he became something much more important. He didn't say he'd fix everything. He didn't vow to protect me from all the evil in the world. He simply stood by my side and respected the boundaries I was still learning to establish. Sometimes we moved forward, sometimes we took a step back. And that, too, was okay. We started spending more time together. We cooked simple dinners, read in the same room, sometimes remained silent for hours, each lost in our own thoughts. For some, this might have seemed boring. For me, it was a miracle. I wasn't being pulled. I wasn't being tested. I wasn't being controlled. I could be there and still be myself. The hardest part wasn't trusting him, but trusting myself. Trusting my feelings, my desires, my refusals. I caught myself automatically saying yes, even when I wasn't sure. And I learned to stop and listen. Sometimes I'd say, "I need time," and he accepted it without offense. Each moment like that strengthened something new in me, an inner core. I continued my studies. The exams weren't easy, especially math, but I didn't give up. Each test wasn't just a step toward a diploma. It was proof that my future wasn't determined by what had happened to me in the past. I began to dream, cautiously but seriously. Not about a fairy tale, but about stability. About a profession. About a home where no one raises their voice. Working at the laundry gradually became a temporary stepping stone, not a final destination. Mrs. O'Neill noticed my meticulousness, responsibility, and ability to learn quickly. She offered me a chance to try my hand at administrative work, keeping records, processing orders, and handling paperwork. I was afraid. I associated paperwork with control, with signatures that had once deprived me of choice. But I agreed. The first day in the small office above the laundry was like the first day of school. I sat at the desk, my pencils neatly arranged, and caught myself smiling. I was entrusted with the keys to the filing cabinet. Real keys. This symbol didn't escape me. At the same time, my inner life was changing. I started going to meetings of the women's group at the community center. We gathered once a week, drank tea, and talked about various things, about marriages, about losses, about how hard it is to be a woman when people constantly expect something from you. I was silent for a long time listening, and then one day I said it out loud. I was married off when I was 13. The room froze, but not from judgment, from recognition. After that, talking became easier. I didn't tell everything at once, but I no longer hid the truth as if it were a shame. I began to see how many of us were like that, different, with different stories, but with the same pain, and with the same right to life. Thomas and I cautiously began talking about the future. Not about marriage, not about children, too early, but about how we want to live. What's important to us? Where the boundaries are. These were conversations between adults, not promises made out of fear of loneliness. Sometimes we disagreed, and that, too, was new, a disagreement that didn't end in punishment. One day he said, "I don't want you to be with me because you're afraid of being alone. I want you to be with me because you choose." These words became a test for me. I went home and thought for a long time, not about him, but about myself. And I realized I really do choose. Not every day is easy, not without doubts, but truly. I stopped being a fugitive not when the threat disappeared, but when I stopped building my life around what I feared. When I began building it around what was important to me: work, study, silence, respect, freedom. The past still lived within me, but it no longer controlled me. It became part of the story, not the whole book. I learned to look back without falling. I learned to remember without dissolving in memories. By the end of the year, I caught myself with a strange thought. I no longer think about disappearing. I think about staying in this life, in this body, in this name I chose. And that was the greatest achievement. There's a point in life when the past ceases to be a threat and becomes background. It doesn't disappear. It simply recedes. For a long time, I didn't believe this was possible for me. I thought that if I allowed myself to call myself happy, something would inevitably break. As if happiness were bait, followed by retribution. But one day I realized, living in anticipation of a blow is also a form of captivity. I was 22 when this realization finally came. Not in one day, not after some solemn event. Rather, it was built on small details. From the mornings when I woke up without anxiety, from the evenings when I returned home and didn't quicken my step at every sound, from the fact that I could laugh, really, without checking whether it was safe. Working in a hospital's administrative department became a point of support for me. I no longer felt temporary, superfluous. Colleagues consulted with me, entrusted me with figures, documents, and responsibilities. I started saving money not for an escape, but for the future. This was a new way of thinking. Before, any savings meant the possibility of disappearing. Now, it means the possibility of staying. School was coming to an end. Exams, tests, fatigue, it was all hard but pleasant. I was proud of myself, not loudly, but quietly, deeply. Sometimes, sitting at my desk in the evening with my notebooks, I thought about that girl from Kentucky who read books by kerosene lamp and didn't know why she needed that knowledge. Now I knew, so that one day I wouldn't believe you have no choice. My relationship with Thomas developed smoothly. We continued to take our time, and that was precisely what made it strong. I didn't feel like I had to measure up. He saw me in many ways, strong, tired, withdrawn, sometimes abrupt. And he didn't try to fix it. Sometimes we argued. Sometimes we were silent. Sometimes we separated for a few days to think. But we always returned to the conversation. One evening, while we were having dinner at his house, he said, "I don't want to rush you, but I need to know, do you see me in your future?" The question was simple, but a wave rose within me. Before, such words had meant a trap, a commitment without an escape. Now, a choice. I didn't answer right away. I asked for time, and he gave it. That night, I hardly slept. I didn't think about him. I thought about myself, about who I'd become, about what I still fear, and about what I wanted. And for the first time in a long time, my desires spoke louder than my fears. I wanted a home where I could be vulnerable. I wanted partnership, not submission. I wanted a love in which I didn't have to disappear. In the morning, I realized I was ready, not because the fear had gone away, but because it was no longer the main thing. We got married a year later, without pomp, without other people's expectations. A small ceremony in a city park, a few friends, Lily and Mrs. O'Neill, the women from the support group. I was wearing a simple light dress that I had chosen myself, without a veil. I didn't need to hide. When I said yes, my voice didn't tremble. This marriage wasn't the end of my story. It was a continuation. I didn't dissolve into it. I didn't disappear. I remained Clara, with my past, with my scars, with my strength. Thomas knew this and accepted it. Sometimes I still had old dreams. Sometimes I woke up in the middle of the night and sat for a long time, listening to the silence. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He was simply there. A few years later, our daughter was born. I feared motherhood more than anything in the world. I feared repeating my mistakes. I feared not protecting her. I feared that the past would somehow be passed on to her through me. But when I held her in my arms for the first time, the fear receded. Resolve remained. I knew I would do everything so that she would never doubt her worth. I taught her to say no. I taught her to ask questions. I taught her that love doesn't require pain, that respect is the foundation. I wasn't a perfect mother, but I was honest and attentive, and that was enough. The past sometimes reminded me of itself, not through letters, but through silence. I learned that Walter had died. This news didn't bring the relief I expected, only peace. As if the last door had closed of its own accord. I no longer needed to keep it locked. I didn't return to Kentucky, but I made peace with the part of me that came from there. I stopped being ashamed of my history. It no longer defined me entirely. It became part of the journey, difficult but not the only one. When people asked me if I was happy, I no longer shied away. I said, yes, in my own way. This, in my own way, was important. It meant happiness built not on illusions, but on awareness. Not without pain, but without violence. Not without memory, but without fear. I understood one simple thing. Happiness is not a reward for suffering. It is a right, and you don't have to earn it. Old age doesn't come suddenly. It creeps up quietly, like the evening light that slowly glides across the walls until you notice the day is already over. I'm 82. I live in a small house near the river, where the fog lingers low in the mornings, and it seems as if the world hasn't yet decided whether to begin a new day. I have a rocking chair, an old radio, photographs on the walls, and a body that reminds me of the years I've lived with the pain in my joints and the slowness of my movements. But there's something else too, a silence within. A real one, not frightening, well-earned. Thomas died 7 years ago. His heart, quickly, without suffering. I held his hand and knew we'd lived a good life. Not perfect, not a fairy tale, but an honest one. After his death, I spent a long time learning to be alone again, but this loneliness was different. It didn't consume me. It simply was. I knew who I was. I knew I wouldn't disappear if there was no one in the room. My daughter is long grown up. She has her own life, her own children, her own worries. She calls me on Sundays and always asks how I'm really feeling, not just out of politeness. I smile when I hear her voice. She doesn't have the fear I had at her age. And that's my greatest victory. Sometimes at night, the past still returns. Not like before. Without panic, without horror. Just memories like old movie stills. The house in Kentucky. The rain. The creaking of the porch. I don't push these images away. I allow them to be. They no longer have power over me. They are part of the path I've walked. I often think about the girl I was. The one they sold, broke, tried to erase. If I could sit next to her now, I wouldn't say big words. I would simply say, you will survive. And not just survive, you will live. Sometimes I feel like this is why I've lived all these years, to one day have the right to say it out loud. The world has changed. Girls know more now. They speak louder. They demand. But there are still those who are silenced, who are convinced they have no choice. I know there is always a choice. Sometimes it's scary. Sometimes it's dangerous. Sometimes it costs everything you have. But it's there. I tell my story not because it's special, but because it's one of many that have been kept in silence for too long. We were taught to endure. We were taught to be grateful for pain. We were taught to remain silent. But silence never protected those who suffered. It only protected those who harmed. If you're reading this and feel stuck, like there's no way out, like the past is holding you by the throat, listen to an old woman. Fear lies. It always lies. He says you can't handle it, that you're too weak, that the world is too cruel. The world really can be cruel, but you're stronger than you think. Strength isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it. I'm often asked if I regret anything. I regret that no one protected me then. I regret believing for too long that there was something wrong with me. But I don't regret leaving. I don't regret choosing myself. I don't regret every step that brought me here, to this doorstep, overlooking the river, with peace within. Life doesn't have to be loud to be valuable. It can be quiet. It can be simple. The main thing is that it's yours. When the sun sets, I step out onto the porch and watch the light change. I think about all the places I've never been and how strange and wonderful it is that my words can reach them without me. I think about the women I'll never know, but who perhaps recognize themselves in me. And if even one of them feels she's not alone, then it was all worth it. We never forget the day our dreams were taken from us, but we can choose the day we begin to build new ones. And that's the most important thing I wanted to say. When a person lives a long life, memories stop lining up. They exist in layers. Sometimes the same morning carries within itself several ages at once. The trembling of a girl, the caution of a young woman, the calm of an old woman. I stopped being surprised by this long ago. Time is not a straight road. It's a house with many rooms, and sometimes you enter a different one than you intended. I often think about how strange memory works. It doesn't store everything. She treasures what matters. Not dates, not exact words, but feelings. The cold floor beneath bare feet. The smell of rain before trouble. The warmth of someone else's hand, which suddenly feels safe. If I close my eyes, I can walk my entire life just like this. Not by years, but by feelings. I'm no longer afraid of these walks. Before, every memory was like a sharp shard. Now it's like a stone smoothed by water. It's still heavy, but it doesn't cut. I've learned to hold it in my hands. Sometimes young women come to me. My daughter brings her friends. My granddaughter brings hers. They know that I've seen a lot. Sometimes they ask cautiously, sometimes directly. I don't tell everything. Not because I'm ashamed, because every story must be heard in time. But if I see a question in their eyes that can't be left unanswered, I speak up. I talk about the right to leave, about the right not to explain, about how love shouldn't require self-destruction. I speak quietly, without pathos, and I see something in them straighten out. Not immediately, not forever, but enough to sow doubt in old, harmful truths. When you've lived a life in which they tried to deprive you of your voice, you especially value the opportunity to speak. But even more, the opportunity to be heard. I know my story won't be comfortable for everyone. Not everyone will like it. It doesn't fit neatly into any framework. There are no pure villains or flawless heroes. There are people, and there are consequences. I didn't become a saint. I didn't become a symbol. I simply became myself. A woman who survived, learned to live, and didn't let pain turn into cruelty. This, as it turns out, is the hardest thing. Sometimes I ask myself, if I could live it all over again, knowing the outcome, would I change anything? And every time my answer is honest, yes. I wish I didn't have to be so strong. But since I did, I'm glad I did. Old age teaches one important skill: letting go. Not forgetting, but letting go. I let go of anger. I let go of expecting an apology. I let go of the idea that justice always comes on time. It doesn't have to. Sometimes, justice is simply a life lived in defiance. When I think about the end, I'm not afraid. I don't expect it, but I'm not afraid either. I have enough days to live without rushing. I did everything I could. I passed on what was important. The rest is beyond my control. If my words reach someone standing on the edge right now, let them be not a push, but a support. Not a command, but a confirmation. You're not going crazy. You're not overly sensitive. You don't have to endure. The world can be different, and you have the right to seek it. Someday my house will be empty. The rocking chair will stand motionless. The radio will go silent. But I believe the voice doesn't disappear with the body. It remains in those who heard and recognized themselves, in those who dared, in those who chose to live. And if this happens even once, then it was not in vain.